Confidence does not disappear because life becomes difficult or circumstances suddenly become unfair. Confidence disappears the moment your mind quietly realizes that your word can no longer be trusted. Every time you promise yourself you will rise earlier tomorrow and remain in bed instead, something breaks. Every time you declare that you will begin the work today and then postpone it again, something weakens. Your mind watches these moments carefully and records them without emotion or argument. It learns that your instructions carry uncertainty, and slowly it stops obeying them with seriousness. This audiobook will confront the one problem most people never address honestly: the quiet collapse of self-trust that follows years of broken promises made privately to yourself. But here is the truth that changes everything. The moment you begin keeping even the smallest promises you make to yourself, confidence starts returning immediately. Not slowly, not someday, immediately. Chapter 1. The Broken Contract Within. Confidence begins to collapse the moment you repeatedly ignore the promises you quietly make to yourself. This collapse rarely announces itself loudly, yet its consequences quietly reshape your identity and personal authority. Every private commitment forms a silent contract between the person you are and the person you intend becoming. When that contract remains unfulfilled, something deeper than productivity begins to erode within your character. You may believe confidence comes from praise, success, recognition, or moments when life appears temporarily cooperative. Yet real confidence develops from something far quieter, far stricter, and far less visible to other people. Confidence grows when your mind learns through experience that your word reliably produces corresponding action. Each time you promise yourself that you will rise early tomorrow and you fail, a message forms. The message does not scream or accuse, yet your mind records it with complete seriousness. It records that your word carries uncertainty, hesitation, and eventually very little dependable authority. You may not consciously notice this internal evaluation happening, yet your nervous system never overlooks it. Your mind constantly measures whether your instructions deserve attention or can safely be ignored without consequence. If your actions repeatedly contradict your stated intentions, your mind begins adjusting expectations about your reliability. Slowly, subtly, it concludes that your instructions rarely lead to disciplined execution or meaningful follow-through. Once that quiet conclusion settles, something dangerous begins shaping your behavior without obvious warning. Your motivation weakens because your mind no longer fully believes that your decisions will actually materialize. You begin planning things with enthusiasm, yet the plans feel strangely hollow beneath their surface. This hollow feeling emerges because your mind remembers previous commitments that quietly dissolved without completion. Over time, the gap between intention and action becomes your default pattern rather than an occasional failure. You promise change, improvement, discipline, or structure, yet your past experience quietly contradicts those declarations. Eventually, your mind stops expecting real follow-through and begins conserving energy for disappointment instead. This shift does not feel dramatic, yet it steadily weakens your internal posture toward responsibility and effort. Many people attempt to rebuild confidence through motivation, excitement, or inspirational declarations about future discipline. However, motivation cannot repair a contract that your actions have repeatedly broken without accountability or correction. Your mind respects evidence, not enthusiasm, and it evaluates your reliability based entirely on consistent behavior. When evidence repeatedly shows abandoned commitments, your mind simply adjusts expectations downward without emotional argument. You begin doubting yourself before difficult work even begins because past experience offers little reason for trust. Your intentions remain sincere, yet sincerity alone cannot repair a record of broken personal agreements. Confidence, therefore, cannot be restored through louder promises, dramatic resolutions, or emotional bursts of determination. Confidence returns only when your behavior begins producing proof that your word once again carries operational weight. This realization may feel uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of blaming circumstances, mood, or temporary pressure. It directs attention toward something far more demanding and far more honest than external explanations. It directs attention toward the contract you have repeatedly signed and quietly broken with yourself. You might promise that tomorrow you will exercise, study, write, build, repair, improve, or advance something meaningful. Yet tomorrow arrives, resistance appears, and the promise slowly dissolves without confrontation or decisive correction. The failure may seem small, almost harmless, when viewed through the lens of a single day. However, your mind does not evaluate promises individually. It evaluates patterns that emerge across repeated experiences. When that pattern becomes one of hesitation and abandonment, your identity slowly absorbs the consequences. You begin seeing yourself as someone who intends discipline, but rarely delivers disciplined execution. This identity forms quietly yet powerfully, because identity follows behavior far more than aspiration. What you repeatedly do becomes the evidence your mind uses when defining who you truly are. Therefore, broken promises rarely remain isolated mistakes. They gradually become structural components of identity. You begin negotiating with yourself more frequently because authority inside your mind has weakened significantly. Simple decisions require debate, persuasion, and internal argument because your commands no longer carry automatic respect. Instead of acting immediately, you negotiate comfort, postpone effort, and delay responsibility for easier moments later. Yet later rarely arrives with stronger discipline because the same weakened authority continues governing your behavior. The cycle slowly convinces you that discipline feels unnatural, heavy, or incompatible with your personality. In truth, the difficulty comes from damaged internal credibility rather than lack of natural capability. Your mind resists commands that historically failed to produce action because it learned those commands lack enforcement. Imagine working under a leader who constantly announces plans yet rarely follows them with real execution. Eventually you would listen politely while quietly expecting that little meaningful action will actually occur. The same dynamic develops between your intentions and your behavior when promises repeatedly remain unfinished. Your mind becomes that skeptical observer who waits patiently for your enthusiasm to fade again. Confidence cannot survive in that environment because trust requires consistent alignment between instruction and action. Without alignment, your words become suggestions rather than commitments, carrying measurable consequences. This truth may sound strict, yet it remains deeply fair and completely within your control. Your mind does not demand perfection. It simply demands consistency between your promises and your behavior. Each kept promise quietly rebuilds authority that repeated abandonment previously weakened over time. You do not need dramatic transformation or heroic discipline during the earliest stages of rebuilding self-trust. You need something more precise, more controlled, and more reliable than grand declarations. You need evidence that your word once again carries weight inside your own life. When your actions consistently honor even modest commitments, your mind begins adjusting expectations upward again. It observes behavior carefully and gradually concludes that your instructions deserve renewed respect and compliance. Confidence slowly returns because trust begins forming again between your decisions and your disciplined execution. This rebuilding requires patience because trust eroded through repetition and must recover through repetition as well. Yet the process remains entirely achievable because every kept promise strengthens the contract you maintain with yourself. You are not repairing motivation, you are repairing credibility within your own internal command structure. Once credibility returns, discipline feels less like struggle and more like natural obedience to your word. The broken contract within you does not require shame, blame, or harsh judgment to correct. It requires clear awareness and steady commitment to honoring the promises you deliberately create. When your actions begin proving that your word reliably becomes behavior, something powerful stabilizes inside you. Confidence returns quietly, steadily, and without unnecessary drama because trust has been rebuilt where it truly matters. Chapter 2. The Hidden Cost of Self-Betrayal. Self-betrayal begins the moment you knowingly abandon a commitment you deliberately made to yourself earlier. The moment may appear small, yet its psychological impact quietly reshapes your internal structure of authority. You may believe the decision carries little consequence because no one else witnesses the abandoned promise. However, your mind witnesses every moment with exact clarity and records the outcome without emotional negotiation. Your mind observes that your instructions can be ignored whenever resistance becomes uncomfortable or inconvenient. Once this observation repeats frequently, your internal authority begins weakening across every meaningful area of life. Authority within your own mind does not depend on titles, knowledge, or external recognition from others. It depends entirely on whether your decisions consistently translate into measurable action without repeated negotiation. When your mind learns that your word does not reliably produce action, obedience begins disappearing gradually. Tasks feel heavier, discipline feels unnatural, and resistance gains strength whenever effort becomes temporarily unpleasant. This shift rarely feels dramatic because it develops through quiet repetition rather than sudden collapse. Yet the long-term effects slowly influence motivation, identity, and personal ambition more deeply than expected. Each ignored promise subtly trains your mind to expect inconsistency from your future decisions. Your mind becomes cautious about investing energy into plans that historically dissolve before completion arrives. It begins protecting itself from disappointment by lowering expectations regarding your ability to follow through. This protective adjustment may feel like laziness, procrastination, or sudden loss of motivation. In reality, it reflects a logical response to repeated evidence showing that your intentions often remain unfinished. Your mind does not sabotage you. It adapts intelligently to patterns it repeatedly observes in your behavior. When promises collapse frequently, the mind conserves effort because it expects wasted energy otherwise. Motivation weakens because motivation thrives only when action regularly confirms that effort produces real progress. Without that confirmation, enthusiasm begins fading quickly after the initial excitement surrounding a new intention. You may announce ambitious goals for discipline, productivity, or self-improvement with sincere conviction and determination. Yet when those goals repeatedly collapse under small resistance, your mind quietly adjusts future expectations downward. Eventually, you stop believing your own declarations because experience consistently contradicts those hopeful statements. This internal contradiction creates a subtle tension between who you claim to become and who you behave like daily. That tension drains energy because maintaining unrealistic self-belief requires constant psychological negotiation. You promise change, yet your behavior offers evidence suggesting that change rarely survives pressure or discomfort. Your mind begins trusting behavior more than intention, because behavior provides the only reliable data available. The result becomes a quiet erosion of self-respect that many people struggle to identify clearly. Self-respect grows when your behavior proves that your word carries seriousness and operational authority. Self-respect weakens when your promises dissolve repeatedly without consequence or disciplined correction afterward. Over time, this erosion affects more than productivity. It reshapes your perception of personal capability. You begin underestimating yourself, not because you lack ability, but because your history suggests unreliability. Your mind assumes that future effort will probably follow the same pattern observed repeatedly in the past. This assumption influences decisions long before real effort begins, quietly lowering ambition and initiative. You hesitate before committing to demanding goals because your internal record questions whether completion will occur. Opportunities appear demanding rather than exciting because self-trust no longer supports bold and decisive action. This hesitation often appears externally as fear, doubt, or lack of confidence in challenging environments. Yet the deeper cause usually traces back to a pattern of broken commitments made privately over time. Your mind remembers every abandoned promise more clearly than every enthusiastic declaration of future discipline. That memory shapes expectations about what will happen when effort becomes difficult again tomorrow. Self-betrayal, therefore, carries a hidden cost far greater than the task you temporarily avoided completing. It weakens the command structure through which your intentions normally become discipline, reliable behavior. When that structure weakens, every future decision requires more energy because obedience no longer comes automatically. Instead of acting immediately, you negotiate internally, debate options, and delay movement toward responsibility. Your mind has learned that your commands may not deserve immediate compliance because enforcement rarely occurs. This pattern creates an exhausting cycle where even simple commitments require unnecessary psychological effort. The solution cannot involve louder motivation or stronger emotional pressure to force temporary productivity. Temporary force does not repair credibility. It only creates brief activity without rebuilding lasting internal authority. True recovery requires something quieter, steadier, and far more disciplined than emotional intensity. It requires consistent evidence showing that your word once again produces predictable action without hesitation. Your mind must relearn through repeated experience that your instructions reliably become executed behavior. This learning process cannot be rushed because trust rebuilds only through patterns observed over meaningful time. Each kept promise provides a small yet powerful correction to the pattern of previous self-betrayal. Your mind notices the correction immediately, even if the external achievement appears modest or ordinary. What matters is not the size of the promise, but the reliability with which it becomes completed action. Reliability restores authority because authority depends on predictable alignment between decision and execution. When that alignment begins appearing consistently, your mind gradually releases the defensive skepticism developed earlier. It begins trusting your instructions again and responds with renewed cooperation rather than quiet resistance. Motivation strengthens naturally because the mind expects effort to produce genuine follow-through this time. Confidence, therefore, grows not from dramatic victories, but from disciplined consistency in honoring your own word. Every kept promise repairs a fragment of credibility that self-betrayal previously damaged across repeated experiences. This repair process requires patience and honesty because shortcuts cannot produce genuine self-trust. Your mind accepts only behavioral evidence when determining whether your promises deserve renewed respect. When your actions consistently confirm your words, something powerful stabilizes within your identity again. You become someone whose decisions carry real weight, not temporary enthusiasm without disciplined completion. The hidden cost of self-betrayal begins disappearing once your behavior consistently restores integrity between intention and action. And when that integrity stabilizes, confidence returns quietly because your mind finally trusts the authority of your word again. Chapter 3. Rebuilding the architecture of self-trust. Self-trust is not restored through declarations, optimism, or emotional resolve made during moments of temporary clarity. Self-trust returns only when your behavior begins forming a consistent pattern that your mind recognizes as reliable. You must understand that your mind operates through observation rather than belief or personal sympathy. It evaluates what you repeatedly do, not what you sincerely hope to accomplish in the future. If your history shows hesitation, delay, and unfinished commitments, your mind simply adjusts its expectations accordingly. It does not criticize you, yet it refuses to grant authority to instructions that rarely produce disciplined execution. Rebuilding self-trust therefore requires a structural approach rather than emotional enthusiasm or temporary determination. You must construct a pattern of action so consistent that your mind begins recognizing your decisions as dependable again. This reconstruction resembles architecture far more than inspiration or motivational intensity. Every kept promise becomes a structural beam supporting the internal framework of your credibility. The beam may appear small in isolation, yet many small beams combined create powerful structural stability. Confidence grows from this structure because your mind finally observes proof that your word produces predictable results. You cannot rebuild self-trust by attempting dramatic transformation across every area of life simultaneously. Large promises often collapse under pressure when the underlying structure of discipline remains weak. Your mind needs manageable commitments that can consistently translate into visible action without negotiation. These commitments must be small enough that completion becomes non-negotiable rather than intimidating or overwhelming. When promises remain small, resistance has very little opportunity to justify avoidance or delay. The mind cannot easily argue against actions that require only modest effort, yet demand complete follow-through. Each time you execute one of these small commitments exactly as promised, something important begins strengthening. Your mind records a new data point, proving that your word still carries operational authority. At first, this change feels quiet and almost insignificant compared with the dramatic transformation you might desire. However, structural rebuilding always begins with foundations that appear modest before supporting greater weight later. Your responsibility during this stage is simple, yet extremely serious in its long-term consequences. You must keep every promise you intentionally create, regardless of how minor the commitment may appear. If you promise yourself that you will read for 15 minutes tonight, the promise must be honored completely. If you promise that you will walk for 10 minutes tomorrow morning, the action must occur exactly as declared.
These commitments do not exist to impress anyone or create dramatic, visible progress.
They exist to restore credibility between your decisions and your disciplined execution. When your mind observes that promises are now consistently fulfilled, skepticism slowly begins dissolving. It recognizes that your instructions have regained seriousness and deserve immediate cooperation once again. The architecture of self-trust strengthens quietly through these repeated confirmations of reliability. You begin experiencing a subtle but powerful change within your daily behavior and internal posture. Tasks that once required negotiation begin happening more automatically because your word carries renewed authority. Your mind stops debating simple commitments because past experience now suggests that execution will actually occur. This shift removes enormous psychological friction from your daily life and disciplined effort. Instead of negotiating with yourself constantly, you act with calm decisiveness and predictable follow-through. The rebuilding process also reshapes how you perceive responsibility and discomfort when they appear unexpectedly. Discomfort stops functioning as a signal to abandon commitments and becomes merely a temporary condition to navigate. Because your mind trusts your instructions again, resistance loses its ability to override your stated intentions. You begin discovering that discipline feels different when credibility has been restored internally. Discipline stops feeling like forced obedience and begins resembling natural alignment with your own word. This alignment produces a deep form of confidence that external praise cannot replicate or replace. External recognition often disappears during difficult seasons, yet internal credibility remains entirely within your control. When you trust your own word, your confidence remains stable, even when circumstances become demanding or uncertain. This stability forms the foundation of disciplined living because it removes dependence on motivation or emotional readiness. You act because your word carries authority, not because the moment happens to feel convenient or inspiring. Over time, the architecture of self-trust becomes strong enough to support larger responsibilities and more demanding goals. You can begin making greater commitments because your mind now expects those commitments to reach completion. This expectation transforms how you approach ambition, challenge, and long-term achievement across every important area. You stop questioning whether you possess the discipline required for meaningful progress in your life. Instead, you focus calmly on the actions required because you trust yourself to execute them consistently. This trust removes hesitation and replaces it with deliberate, steady movement toward meaningful responsibility. Rebuilding self-trust therefore represents one of the most important disciplines you will ever develop. It influences your ability to lead yourself, manage pressure, and pursue goals without constant internal resistance. Every kept promise strengthens the structure, supporting your identity as someone who follows through reliably. You become a person whose word carries quiet strength rather than hopeful enthusiasm without consistent execution. That strength grows through disciplined repetition, not through dramatic declarations about future transformation. Each promise kept becomes another beam reinforcing the internal structure that supports confidence and responsibility. Over time, the structure becomes strong enough that doubt loses its influence over your daily decisions. You no longer question whether you will act because your history proves that you consistently honor your commitments. This certainty creates calm confidence rather than loud self-assurance or emotional excitement about your discipline. Your actions speak quietly yet convincingly through the evidence they produce each day. The architecture of self-trust therefore becomes a living structure built through your consistent obedience to your word. Once that structure stands firmly, your confidence no longer depends on circumstances or temporary emotional states. It depends on something far stronger and far more reliable than motivation alone. It depends on the simple fact that when you make a promise to yourself, you keep it. Chapter 4. The Micro-Promise Method. Discipline becomes reliable when commitments become small enough that completion cannot be avoided through negotiation. Large promises often collapse under pressure because they create unnecessary resistance inside the mind. Your mind does not fear discipline itself. It fears overwhelming demands that appear difficult to sustain consistently. When a promise feels heavy or complicated, hesitation naturally begins forming before the work even begins. The micro-promise method removes that hesitation by shrinking commitments into actions that remain entirely manageable. These commitments are deliberately small, precise, and completely achievable without dramatic emotional preparation. A micro-promise does not attempt to transform your entire life within a single declaration. Instead, it focuses on a small, clear action that you can execute consistently without debate or resistance. For example, you may promise yourself that you will read for 10 minutes every evening before resting. Another micro-promise may involve writing a single page, walking for 10 minutes, or reviewing one important task. Each promise remains modest, yet the discipline required to keep it must remain absolute and uncompromising. The power of this method does not come from the size of the task being completed. It comes from the reliability with which your mind learns that your word always produces corresponding action. Every completed micro-promise becomes a signal reinforcing the credibility of your decisions. Your mind observes the pattern and begins trusting your instructions because they consistently become real behavior. This trust grows gradually yet steadily as the pattern continues repeating across days and weeks. The micro-promise method therefore focuses less on immediate achievement and more on behavioral consistency. You are training your mind to obey your instructions without hesitation or prolonged internal negotiation. When commitments remain small, resistance has little opportunity to justify avoidance or delay. Your mind quickly recognizes that execution requires less energy than debating whether the promise should be ignored. Completion, therefore, becomes the obvious and natural choice each time the commitment appears. As these small promises accumulate, something important begins changing in how you experience discipline. You begin seeing yourself as someone who consistently follows through rather than someone who frequently abandons commitments. Identity begins shifting quietly, because identity always follows patterns of repeated behavior. You no longer describe yourself as someone attempting to develop discipline. You become someone who already demonstrates discipline through reliable completion of your commitments. This shift strengthens confidence because your mind now possesses clear evidence supporting your reliability. The micro-promise method also protects you from a common mistake many people make when rebuilding discipline. They attempt ambitious routines immediately, only to abandon them when resistance becomes stronger than expected. When large commitments collapse, the internal damage to credibility becomes greater than the temporary progress achieved. Micro-promises prevent this collapse by ensuring that completion remains realistic under normal daily pressure. Even during demanding days when energy feels limited, the commitments remain small enough to honor fully. This reliability protects the growing trust forming between your decisions and your behavior. Over time, the mind begins expecting consistency rather than anticipating another broken commitment. Once this expectation stabilizes, your capacity for discipline expands naturally without forced escalation. You may gradually increase the size of certain promises while preserving the same commitment to completion. However, expansion must always follow demonstrated reliability rather than enthusiastic ambition. Your responsibility remains the same regardless of how large or small the promise appears externally. If the promise exists, it must be honored completely without negotiation or quiet modification later. This strictness is not punishment. It is the protection of your credibility with yourself. Your mind must learn that your word carries final authority once it has been deliberately spoken. The micro-promise method trains that authority carefully and consistently through repeated confirmation. You begin recognizing a powerful truth about discipline as the process continues developing quietly within you. Discipline becomes easier when your mind trusts that your instructions deserve obedience. When credibility exists, action happens smoothly because your internal system no longer questions your leadership. Instead of fighting resistance constantly, you experience cooperation between intention and behavior. This cooperation represents the beginning of true self-discipline rather than forced compliance during moments of motivation. The simplicity of micro-promises also creates clarity within your daily routine and responsibilities. You know exactly what must be done because the commitments remain clear and precisely defined. There is no confusion about expectations and no ambiguity regarding whether the promise has been completed. Either the commitment was honored or it was abandoned, and your mind records the result accordingly. This clarity removes the vague excuses that often weaken accountability in larger, undefined commitments. You cannot claim partial success when a micro-promise remains unfinished because the action required was simple. The method therefore creates a culture of honesty and responsibility within your daily behavior. You begin respecting your own commitments with the seriousness normally reserved for promises made to others. Over time, this seriousness becomes part of your identity, rather than something you occasionally attempt practicing. The micro-promise method ultimately teaches your mind a powerful and stabilizing lesson. When you speak a promise to yourself, action follows without hesitation or debate. This lesson becomes the foundation upon which long-term discipline, confidence, and responsibility continue expanding. And once your mind accepts this pattern as normal behavior, your ability to grow becomes steady and reliable. Chapter 5. Integrity as a daily habit. Integrity is not a grand declaration about who you intend to become in the distant future. Integrity is the quiet discipline of ensuring that your actions consistently align with the promises you make to yourself. Most people imagine integrity as a moral quality, displayed in public situations involving honesty or fairness. Yet the deepest form of integrity develops in private moments when no one else witnesses your decisions. It appears when you follow through on a commitment, even though no external pressure demands completion. It strengthens when your behavior remains consistent with your word, despite fatigue, inconvenience, or temporary resistance. This form of integrity is personal, disciplined, and entirely independent from recognition or approval from others. When you repeatedly demonstrate this alignment between your word and your actions, confidence begins growing naturally. You do not need to convince yourself that you are disciplined, because your behavior already provides undeniable evidence. Your mind notices this evidence carefully and begins trusting your internal leadership more than it once did. Confidence, therefore, becomes the natural consequence of integrity, practiced daily rather than a personality trait. It develops because your mind observes a pattern of reliability in how you conduct your responsibilities. You say something will happen, and then the action happens without negotiation or delay. The consistency of this pattern builds a deep form of stability within your identity and decision-making process. When integrity becomes a habit, your mind stops questioning whether commitments will actually reach completion. Instead, it assumes completion because your history demonstrates disciplined follow-through across repeated situations. This assumption removes the uncertainty that previously weakened your motivation and sense of authority. You begin approaching responsibilities with calm assurance rather than hesitation or quiet doubt about your reliability. Integrity practiced daily also changes how you respond to resistance when effort becomes uncomfortable. Discomfort no longer becomes a valid reason to abandon commitments because your word holds greater authority. You recognize that temporary difficulty cannot justify violating the promises you deliberately created. This recognition strengthens discipline because it removes the habit of negotiating with resistance. Your decisions stop depending on how you feel in a particular moment. Instead, your actions depend on what you already committed to accomplish earlier with clear intention. The distinction may appear subtle, yet its consequences reshape your daily behavior profoundly. When feelings determine action, discipline remains unstable and easily disrupted by fatigue or distraction. When commitments determine action, discipline becomes steady because promises carry authority beyond temporary emotion. Integrity, therefore, becomes the mechanism through which your commitments maintain power over your behavior. Each day offers countless small opportunities to practice this alignment between your word and your actions. Some opportunities appear trivial, yet each one quietly strengthens or weakens the credibility you maintain with yourself. If you promise to complete a small task before resting, integrity demands that the task be completed. If you promise to begin a responsibility at a certain time, integrity requires honoring that agreement precisely. These moments may seem ordinary, yet they accumulate into powerful patterns shaping your internal character. Your mind does not separate large promises from small ones when evaluating your reliability. It simply observes whether your behavior consistently reflects the commitments you created earlier. When the pattern shows alignment, confidence grows because trust becomes justified through repeated evidence. You begin trusting your own decisions because experience proves that your actions reliably follow them. This trust creates a powerful form of personal authority that influences every area of your life. You become someone who can plan carefully and then execute those plans without constant internal negotiation. Your mind no longer treats your commitments as suggestions that may be ignored under pressure. Instead, it treats them as instructions carrying real authority and measurable consequence. Integrity practiced daily also removes the emotional drama many people associate with discipline and self-improvement. You no longer rely on excitement, inspiration, or dramatic bursts of motivation to accomplish your responsibilities. Your behavior becomes steady because it rests on the simple principle of honoring your word consistently. This steadiness produces calm confidence rather than temporary enthusiasm followed by repeated disappointment. Others may not always recognize the discipline guiding your daily decisions and commitments. Yet recognition from others is not necessary because the most important observer remains your own mind. Your mind records every kept promise and gradually rebuilds the trust that earlier inconsistency weakened. As this trust grows stronger, your identity begins stabilizing around reliability and responsibility. You begin seeing yourself as someone whose word carries weight, rather than someone who frequently postpones effort. This shift influences how you approach goals, challenges, and long-term responsibilities. You no longer doubt your ability to remain consistent because your daily habits already prove that consistency exists. Integrity, therefore, becomes the quiet foundation supporting your confidence and disciplined living. It does not demand perfection, yet it demands honesty and commitment regarding the promises you deliberately create. When integrity becomes habitual, your actions consistently reflect your stated intentions without contradiction. Your life begins showing alignment between what you say and what you actually do each day. That alignment produces a calm form of confidence that no external validation can replace. You trust yourself because you have repeatedly proven that your word remains reliable under normal daily pressure. And once this reliability becomes part of your identity, discipline stops feeling like effort and begins feeling natural. Integrity practiced daily therefore becomes one of the most powerful forces shaping your confidence and personal authority. When your word consistently becomes action, your mind accepts a simple but powerful truth. You are someone whose promises deserve trust. Chapter 6. Training the mind to obey. Your mind must learn to obey your decisions even when motivation disappears and resistance begins pressing strongly. Without this obedience, every commitment becomes vulnerable to negotiation whenever effort feels inconvenient or uncomfortable. Many people assume discipline means forcing themselves to act through emotional pressure or temporary bursts of willpower. However, real discipline develops when your mind accepts your instructions as final without repeated internal debate. This obedience does not appear automatically simply because you desire stronger discipline or better habits. It must be trained carefully through consistent demonstration that your decisions will always be executed. Your mind behaves much like a system responding to patterns rather than inspirational speeches or hopeful intentions. If it observes that instructions regularly collapse under pressure, it learns that obedience remains optional. When it observes that instructions consistently lead to action, it learns that obedience becomes necessary. Training your mind, therefore, requires eliminating the habit of negotiating with your commitments once they exist. Negotiation begins the moment resistance offers an alternative that appears more comfortable than disciplined action. You may hear quiet suggestions encouraging delay, modification, or postponement until circumstances feel more favorable. If you accept those suggestions repeatedly, Your mind learns that instructions can be revised whenever discomfort appears. Obedience weakens because the command structure governing your behavior no longer appears stable. To train obedience effectively, your response must remain consistent whenever resistance attempts influencing your behavior. The response is simple and firm, without emotional struggle or unnecessary internal argument. The commitment exists, therefore the action must occur exactly as promised. This approach removes unnecessary drama from discipline because it avoids debating resistance each time it appears. Your mind gradually learns that resistance will not produce negotiation or revision once a decision has been made. At first, this training process may feel demanding because resistance often appears persuasive during moments of fatigue. However, each completed action reinforces the lesson that your instructions carry authority over temporary feelings. Your mind notices the pattern and slowly begins cooperating rather than arguing against your decisions. You begin experiencing something powerful that many people rarely encounter during their pursuit of discipline. Your mind begins executing commitments automatically because it trusts that negotiation will not change the outcome. This automatic obedience removes a tremendous amount of psychological friction from your daily responsibilities. Tasks no longer require prolonged preparation or emotional encouragement before action begins. Instead, you move directly from decision to execution with calm efficiency and deliberate focus. The training process also strengthens your ability to remain steady during challenging situations or unexpected pressure. Because your mind respects your instructions, it responds with discipline rather than confusion or hesitation. You know what must be done, and your behavior follows that knowledge without prolonged debate. This clarity becomes especially valuable during periods when motivation naturally disappears for extended periods. Motivation rises and falls unpredictably because it depends on mood, energy, and external circumstances. Obedience trained through disciplined repetition remains stable even when those conditions change significantly. You act because you decided earlier, not because the moment feels inspiring or emotionally comfortable. Over time, this reliability reshapes how you perceive responsibility and personal capability. You begin trusting your ability to follow through regardless of emotional conditions or temporary discomfort. That trust produces a quiet form of strength, allowing you to approach demanding responsibilities calmly. Your mind knows that decisions made deliberately will be executed regardless of resistance encountered later. This knowledge eliminates much of the doubt that once accompanied your commitments and ambitions. You stop wondering whether you will maintain discipline because your history demonstrates reliable obedience. Training the mind to obey, therefore, represents one of the most valuable skills you can develop. It allows your intentions to become action consistently rather than remaining ideas waiting for favorable conditions. Each time you follow through, despite resistance, the lesson becomes stronger and more deeply embedded. Your mind accepts a simple truth based entirely on evidence observed repeatedly. When you decide something will happen, the action will occur regardless of discomfort or temporary hesitation. This acceptance creates a powerful alignment between your intentions and your daily behavior. You stop fighting yourself constantly and begin directing your energy toward meaningful execution instead. Obedience replaces negotiation, and discipline replaces uncertainty about whether commitments will survive pressure. Your internal leadership becomes firm, steady, and reliable because your mind respects the authority behind your word. Once this respect exists, your capacity for sustained discipline expands naturally across every important area of life. You become someone who does not depend on motivation because your mind has learned a more reliable response. When a promise exists, the action follows. Chapter 7. The compounding power of kept promises. Every promise you keep begins producing results far greater than the immediate action you completed. The action itself may appear modest, yet the psychological impact quietly multiplies across your identity and behavior. Compounding occurs when repeated actions gradually amplify their influence over time through consistent reinforcement. In the context of discipline, every kept promise strengthens the expectation that future promises will also be honored. Your mind records this expectation carefully and begins adjusting its internal assumptions about your reliability. At first, the change appears subtle because the individual promises remain small and seemingly ordinary. However, the accumulation of these consistent actions begins forming a powerful pattern of disciplined execution. Patterns carry more influence than isolated moments because they shape how your mind predicts future behavior. When your history shows repeated follow-through, your mind begins assuming that commitments will reach completion. This assumption becomes the foundation upon which confidence quietly develops and stabilizes. Confidence grows not because of dramatic achievements, but because your behavior repeatedly confirms your reliability. Each kept promise becomes another layer of evidence supporting the belief that your word carries operational authority. Over time, this evidence accumulates into a powerful internal record that shapes your identity and expectations. Your mind begins trusting your decisions because history consistently proves that those decisions become action. This trust eliminates the quiet doubt that previously weakened your ability to pursue meaningful goals. You no longer approach commitments with uncertainty about whether your discipline will survive resistance later. Instead, you begin expecting disciplined execution because your behavior has demonstrated that pattern repeatedly. The compounding effect also strengthens your ability to make larger commitments responsibly. Early in the rebuilding process, your promises remain intentionally small to protect reliability and restore credibility. As the pattern of follow-through strengthens, your mind becomes capable of handling greater responsibilities confidently. You can gradually increase the size of your commitments because your discipline has already proven stable. The expansion occurs naturally rather than through forced ambition or emotional enthusiasm. Your mind trusts the process because it has already observed many examples of promises becoming completed action. This trust allows you to approach larger goals without the internal hesitation that once disrupted your efforts. Compounding also affects how you respond to setbacks or temporary difficulty during challenging periods. Because your identity now includes a history of disciplined behavior, isolated obstacles lose their ability to discourage you. You understand that a single difficult day does not erase the consistency you have built over time. Your focus remains on continuing the pattern rather than judging yourself harshly for occasional imperfection. This balanced perspective protects the stability of your discipline during demanding situations. Instead of abandoning commitments after a temporary failure, you calmly restore alignment and continue forward. The compounding effect remains intact because the overall pattern of reliability continues dominating your behavior. Another important consequence of kept promises is the strengthening of your personal authority. Authority does not require external recognition when it develops within your own decision-making structure. Your mind begins treating your instructions with seriousness because experience confirms they lead to real action. This respect eliminates much of the internal resistance that previously complicated even simple responsibilities. You begin executing tasks with quiet efficiency because your mind no longer questions your leadership. The compounding influence of reliability also affects your emotional stability during demanding circumstances. You remain steady because your confidence rests on consistent behavior rather than temporary success or external validation. Even when progress appears slow, you trust the process because your discipline remains intact. You understand that meaningful achievement often emerges gradually through sustained consistency rather than sudden breakthroughs. This understanding protects you from the frustration that often causes people to abandon their efforts prematurely. You recognize that every kept promise contributes to a larger structure developing over time. Each completed commitment strengthens the pattern supporting your confidence and personal authority. This pattern eventually becomes so strong that discipline feels natural rather than forced or unnatural. Your behavior aligns automatically with your commitments because your mind expects that alignment as normal practice. At this stage, the compounding effect becomes clearly visible in how you approach responsibility and long-term goals. You no longer depend on emotional motivation to initiate action because discipline has become habitual. Your mind cooperates with your decisions rather than challenging them with hesitation or doubt. This cooperation allows your energy to focus entirely on execution rather than internal negotiation. You become capable of sustained effort across extended periods because your discipline no longer fluctuates unpredictably. The compounding power of kept promises therefore extends far beyond the tasks you complete each day. It shapes your identity, strengthens your authority, and stabilizes your confidence through repeated evidence of reliability. Your mind accepts a simple conclusion based on the pattern it has observed consistently over time. When you make a promise to yourself, the promise becomes action. This conclusion transforms how you perceive your own potential and responsibility moving forward. You become someone who trusts the process of disciplined consistency because it has already produced meaningful change. Your confidence no longer depends on hope or encouragement because your behavior has proven dependable repeatedly. The compounding effect continues strengthening this foundation as long as the pattern of kept promises remains intact. Every day provides another opportunity to reinforce the credibility and authority you have carefully rebuilt. And with each promise honored, the structure of your confidence becomes stronger and more stable than before. Chapter 8, Becoming the Person You Trust. The ultimate goal of discipline is not merely productivity, achievement, or visible success in demanding situations. The deeper goal is becoming someone whose word carries unquestioned credibility within their own life. When you trust your own word completely, your decisions carry power that transforms how you approach responsibility. You no longer hesitate before committing to meaningful goals because your history proves you will follow through. Your mind expects disciplined execution because that expectation has been reinforced repeatedly over time. This expectation becomes part of your identity rather than something you occasionally attempt practicing. You become the person who does what they said they would do, regardless of temporary discomfort or distraction. That identity does not require loud declarations or visible displays of discipline for others to observe. It exists quietly within the structure of your daily decisions and consistent behavior. When you trust yourself fully, internal conflict begins disappearing from many areas of your life. You do not waste energy debating whether commitments will survive resistance because your history answers that question. Your behavior consistently confirms that promises become action once they have been made deliberately. This certainty creates a calm form of confidence that feels stable and grounded rather than emotional or dramatic. You trust your ability to navigate responsibility because your discipline has proven dependable across many situations. This trust also influences how you approach new challenges and unfamiliar opportunities. Instead of wondering whether you possess enough discipline, you focus on understanding what actions are required. Your attention shifts from questioning your reliability to planning the execution of meaningful work. This shift creates enormous psychological freedom because your energy no longer divides between doubt and action. All of your attention can focus on progress rather than convincing yourself to begin. Becoming someone you trust also changes the way you interpret setbacks and temporary difficulties. You understand that mistakes or imperfect days do not define your identity because your overall pattern remains strong. Your identity rests on consistent reliability rather than flawless execution in every moment. Therefore, when difficulty appears, you simply return to alignment with your commitments and continue forward calmly. Your mind does not panic because it trusts the system you have built through disciplined repetition. The structure supporting your confidence remains stable because it rests on long-term behavioral evidence. This stability allows you to lead yourself effectively, even during periods when circumstances become unpredictable. External conditions may change rapidly, yet your internal credibility remains unaffected by those fluctuations. You trust your capacity to respond with discipline, regardless of pressure or uncertainty. Over time, this internal trust becomes one of the most valuable qualities shaping your personal and professional life. Others may notice your consistency, reliability, and calm approach to responsibility without fully understanding its origin. The origin remains simple yet powerful. You have learned to keep the promises you make to yourself. This practice gradually transformed your identity from someone seeking discipline into someone embodying it naturally. You no longer chase confidence because confidence emerges automatically from your consistent behavior. Each decision you honor reinforces the credibility that defines who you have become. This credibility becomes your quiet advantage in environments where many people struggle with hesitation and inconsistency. You move forward steadily because your mind trusts the instructions you provided. Your promises are no longer fragile ideas vulnerable to resistance or changing emotion. They are commitments supported by a history of disciplined follow-through. Becoming someone you trust does not require perfection or extraordinary talent. It requires honesty about your commitments and the determination to honor them consistently. Every day provides opportunities to reinforce this identity through the promises you deliberately choose to create. Some promises will remain small, while others will gradually expand as your discipline continues strengthening. Regardless of size, each promise carries the same expectation of completion. When your behavior consistently meets that expectation, your confidence continues growing naturally. You trust your own leadership because experience proves that your decisions become reality through disciplined action. This trust stabilizes your ambitions because you know you possess the reliability required to pursue meaningful goals. The promise principle therefore reveals a simple truth that quietly transforms how you live and work. Confidence does not emerge from praise, encouragement, or external validation offered by others. Confidence emerges when your mind learns through experience that your word always becomes action. When that lesson becomes permanent within your identity, something powerful changes in how you see yourself. You are no longer someone hoping to become disciplined. You are someone whose promises carry unbreakable authority. And when your word becomes that reliable, your confidence no longer needs to be manufactured. It exists naturally because the person speaking those promises has proven worthy of trust.